is Surya, and today I'm going to make a gluten-free alternative to tortillas and flatbread. They're called dosas, and I think they taste pretty good. Dosas are a popular Indian food, and they're made from a fermented batter. That means they're probiotic, and if you're like me, that also means they're light and easy on your stomach. Now you can eat dosas with traditional Indian food, or you can just use them as a substitute for wraps or sandwiches. I like to dip mine in soup or hummus. I make breakfast burritos with them. Just use your imagination. To make dosas, you will need a griddle. You can buy a special tava or dosa griddle if you like, but this regular pancake griddle will work just fine. A non-stick griddle will make turning the dosas much easier, but the dosas you get from a cast iron griddle will be nice and crisp with perfect browning. It's a little more work, but it's up to you. Also, you will need a good blender or a food processor. For your ingredients, I recommend a trip to your local Indian grocery store. Now, if you don't have one where you live, don't worry about it because you can order all of these ingredients online. Now, for your first ingredient, you need 1 cup of idli rice. Next, you need 1/2 cup of Urad Dal. Make sure that you don't get the whole black bean. If you get the whole black bean, it will make your dosa batter smell funny and taste funny. So you want to get the skinned, split beans that are light in color like this. You'll also need 2 tablespoons of poha flakes, that's a pounded flattened rice. You also need 1 tablespoon of chana dal, those are split chickpeas. You need sea salt to taste, 1/2 teaspoon to 1 teaspoon of sea salt. And you need fenugreek seeds. You also need water. Make sure you use filtered water only. Do not use water from the tap. Too much chlorine in the water can affect the rising process of your dosas. Now, before you grind the beans and rice in the blender, first you're going to have to soak them. Now, there's 2 reasons. Number 1, if you don't soak these first, they're going to chew up your blender. They're way too hard. And number 2, just soaking beans and rice is a really healthy thing to do because they're going to be more digestible and your body's going to be able to access the nutrients from the beans and rice much better if they've been soaked first. So when you soak, you want to use 2 parts water to 1 part rice. This has been soaking overnight and it's ready to go in the blender. The same with the beans. You want to use 2 parts water to 1 part beans. That's in here. I've got my chana dal, I've got my urad dal, and I've got my fenugreek seeds in this one. And now in here, this is my poha flakes, and I used about 1/2 cup of water to cover them. And I didn't start soaking these until about an hour before these other guys were soaked. The poha flakes take in water really fast, and they only need to soak for about an hour. Okay, so next we want to rinse our rice and beans. We're going to start with the idli rice, and make sure that you use filtered water. Don't use the tap water for this. And I'm just going to give it 2 or 3 rinses. I'm not going to over-rinse it. Over-rinsing can affect the rising process, as can using the chlorinated water. Okay, next I'm going to rinse my chana dal, my urad dal, and my fenugreek seeds, and I'm going to put those into a separate bowl afterwards. Alright, next I'm going to grind the rice. I've added 1/2 cup of water to it in the blender. If it's not grinding well, I can add a little bit more water just to get it to grind. And I'm going to grind this on high speed. And it takes a little bit of time, but not too bad. It goes pretty well in the blender here. Okay, now I'm going to grind the beans. Okay, I've got my Urad Dal, my Chana Dal, and I'm going to put in about a quarter of a cup of water here, not too much. And grind these guys up. Okay, so now I'm adding my Urad Dal, my Chana Dal, and my fenugreek seeds that I ground up together in the blender to the rice mixture that I ground up. And sometimes I take apart the blender just to get every little bit out. So when I mix this up, I want to have not too thick and not too thin of a batter. I want to have sort of the consistency of a nice pancake batter, you know. That's something like that. You don't want it to be like too runny. And better to be a little thick, you know, at first, because if you add too much water and it's runny, then it's not going to be very good at all. You're not going to get good doses. So this is looking about right. Yeah. And once this rises, it will also thicken up a little bit too. So you'll find at the end, sometimes you need to add a little bit of water to thin it down again. But always add your water in small amounts, very small amounts, so you don't thin your batter down too much. Okay, last I'm going to grind up the poha flakes in the blender. I'm not adding any water to these yet unless they have a hard time, unless the blades have a hard time reaching them here. No, but they're going to grind up just fine. They grind up pretty quick. Okay, now I'm ready to add those to my batter. Okay, now we're going to add the poha mixture. The reason I do the poha separately from everything else also is that it makes the batter it gives it kind of a thick jelly-like consistency while you're trying to grind it in the blender, and so I like to add it last. There we go. Now these are ready to set aside to let rise. These are gonna the best place to put this batter to rise is in the oven with just the pilot light on. That's a nice warm place for it, and that's what it needs. You want to find a nice warm dark place for your batter to rise. Okay, so we're ready to put this batter in the oven to rise. It smells a little funny after you've just ground it. I think it smells like green bananas or something. I don't like the smell. I'm going to cover it with a plate, put it in the oven. When it's done rising, it's going to have a nice tart yogurty smell to it. It's going to smell completely different. It's also going to rise to about twice its volume. So let's put it in the oven, do something else for 8 or 10 hours, and come back and see how the batter's doing. Alright, any warm dark place will do. You don't have to put it in the oven, but you know, especially if you live in a cold climate, you want this to have a warm place to rise. So put it in the oven, just use the pilot light, don't turn the oven on. You don't want to cook the batter. So come back in 8 to 10 hours and see how it's doing. Alright, it's been about 10 hours since I set the batter aside to rise. I came back to check it, and I've got about a 60% rise out of it. Now, ideally, you know, the batter's going to rise 100%. You're going to get double what you had in volume. And the thing is I've found that if I wait too long, like it's been 10 hours, I waited 12 hours once to get closer to that 100%, and the batter was very sour. So I'm stopping at 10 tonight. You might find, depending on your climate, the humidity, different factors, that you might get a rise in as little as 6 hours. The main thing that you want to look for, though, more than a big rise out of your batter, and you do want it to rise some, you know, but don't get obsessed with the 100%, it has to double. I found that that has not been true for me, that I need that for good dosas. What you're looking for is a nice, clean, tart, yogurt-like smell to the batter, and also that the batter has changed consistency. It will be a little bit fluffy, and there'll be sort of a velvety smooth consistency. You'll see that it has definitely changed when you stir it. And these are ready to cook, so I'm going to go over to the griddle now. But wait a minute, before I go over to the griddle, I've got one more thing I've got to do, and that is to add the salt. You don't have to add salt, but I really like salt in my food, so I'm going to add a teaspoon to the batter. You can add, you know, just a half a teaspoon if you want as well. But I find it makes all the difference to have a little salt in there. Don't add your salt at first. I understand it can affect the rising process. Okay, it's very important that when you make your dosas, your griddle is hot. If you start with a cold griddle, the dosas aren't going to spread right on there, and they're going to cook funny. So I take a drop of batter, and if I hear it sizzle, then I know I'm ready to cook my dosas. So that gave me a little bit of a sizzle, so I think I'm ready to pour on my batter. I take about 1/3 cup of batter, pour that on the griddle, and then I take a flat bottom measuring cup, and I'm going to use that to spread my dosa batter. I just sort of go around in a circle, and as that dosa batter is cooking on the griddle, I'm going to have to lighten up on my pressure with this measuring cup, or else it will stick to the cup and I'll tear my dosa up off the griddle, and it'll lose its nice shape. So I can feel that that's just started to cook enough to where I can't swirl anymore. As you practice with this, as you go through your batch of dosas, they're going to get bigger and more flat, and they'll look a lot nicer. You know, your first few dosas sometimes come out funny looking. But this wasn't too bad. This is a pretty good looking one. Now as that first side is cooking, you can go ahead and take a little bit of coconut oil and drizzle it on top of the dosa. That's going to make for a crispier dosa. If you're using a cast iron griddle, you want to start with a lot of oil, or a fair amount of oil on the griddle so the dosa doesn't stick. If you're using a non-stick griddle, you want to use very, very little oil. Just spread some oil on with a paper towel. If you use too much oil on the non-stick griddle, you're going to have a hard time spreading the batter properly. So I'm just going to peek under here and see how that's doing. And I'm going to wait for it to get golden brown. It's not there yet. Okay, I'm going to peek under here, and it looks like the first side is done, so I'll flip it over. While the second side is cooking, what I can do, if I want to, now you can serve these flat like a pancake or a crepe, but if you want to be fancy, you can take your spatula and just rock it into the center of the dosa, so you have a little score in there. Now when I turn it over back to the first side, I'll be able to roll it into a cone. Well, there you have it. You can serve these with traditional Indian food. You can serve them with some hummus or some dips. You could make wraps out of them, breakfast burritos, tacos. Let your imagination run wild. I love these things. Thank you for watching my video, and if you found it helpful, please subscribe.